Subcommittee will come to order, and good morning to all of you, and thank you for being here. Today's hearing will examine U.S. policy toward Rwanda following the release on June 26 of a United Nations report confirming Rwanda's support of rebels who have ravaged the provinces of North and South Kivu in neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. In the aftermath of the 1994 genocide, until the issuance of this report, the international community declined to comment on Rwanda's interventions in the DRC. We need to better understand the devastation caused by these interventions and gauge how the United States can play a more meaningful role in bringing this crisis to an end. Unfortunately, our previously scheduled administration witnesses, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Johnny Carson and USAID Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Africa Earl Gast, are unable to testify this morning due to events in the world involving heightened security for U.S. embassies and aid missions. This would have been an opportunity to present a full statement of the administration position on what has happened in the DRC and what needs to be done to more effectively address the root causes of the ongoing conflict there. We do expect that they will be available soon to speak, and they have an open invitation to come before our subcommittee to do just that. Meanwhile, we have a distinguished private panel that will be more than able to shed light on the crisis in the DRC, as well as Rwanda's involvement in the ongoing rebellion in eastern DRC. The crisis in the DRC is both tragic and complex, and the ethnic cleavages have developed over more than a century, although they have been heightened in recent decades. The first significant recorded influx into the DRC of Rwandan Tutsis and Hutus dates back to the 1880s. Other ethnic groups in DRC, also then it was known as Zaire, began to fear the influence of the Rwandans, especially in the east. The Hutu-Tutsi conflict in Rwanda led to the 1994 genocide there, but the Hutu-Tutsi animosity also spilled over into the DRC. Hutu militiamen who fled Rwanda after the genocide have repeatedly attacked Rwanda, and fighting involving Tutsis and Hutus inside the DRC have terrorized the inhabitants of the eastern part of the country. As one of our witnesses today, Congolese Bishop Ntambo and Ntanda will tell us, some 6 million people have lost their lives in the DRC as a result of the recurring conflict. Far from resolving ethnic disputes, the interventions by Rwanda in the DRC have exacerbated tensions among the ethnic groups who live there. In the wake of activity by Rwandan troops or militias that they create or support, Tutsi and Hutu people living in the DRC have become targets as a result. Rwanda has been engaged in armed intervention in the DRC for at least 17 years. If this is the most successful method to halt cross-border attacks into Rwanda by Hutu rebels operating from DRC territory, why is there continued devastation in the region? Why do Tutsis and Hutus living in the DRC seem more hated today than they have been previously? During the summer of 2008, the National Congress for the Defense of the People, or the CNDP, a Congolese rebel group, reportedly was backed secretly by Rwanda. It was initially led by Tutsi General Laurent Nkulu, I should say, and an indicted war criminal. As soon as a March 23, 2009 agreement between the DRC and Rwanda led to the arrest of Nkulu, but replaced him with Bosco Ntanda, even then a suspected war criminal, for whom the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, had issued an arrest warrant in 2006. When CNDP judged that President Joseph Kabila had broken the 2009 accord, Ntanda led a mutiny that named itself M23 for the date of the broken agreement and began a reign of terror in the DRC. In June of this year, a United Nations group of experts report confirmed that Rwandan Defense Minister James Kabarebe and other top Rwandan military officers played a central role in organizing, funding, and arming the mutineers in eastern DRC. The report also stated that Rwandan military officers engaged in efforts to convince Congolese businessmen, politicians, and former rebels that had joined the Congolese army to join the M23 mutiny in order to wage, quote, a new war to obtain a secession of both Kivus. The further report charged that Rwanda was protecting Ntanda from arrest. Meanwhile, Nkulu remains in Rwanda, immune from prosecution for his crimes. Aside from ethnic divisions and allegations of a breach of faith in agreements, another source of conflict has been the abundant mineral wealth in the DRC, including 70% of the world's coltan, used to make vital components in cell phones and other electronic equipment, 30% of the world's diamond reserves, and vast deposits of cobalt, copper, and bauxite. The UN report stated that rebels in the east export precious minerals for profit to fund their continuing mayhem, and that the Rwandan officials were also benefiting from DRC's mineral wealth. I would note parenthetically that I have visited this area. I was shocked and dismayed by the abuse, especially of women, in this area where sexual violence is an everyday occurrence. And in visits to Goma, in visits to meetings with the UN deployment of peacekeepers, became very clear that the people in the villages continue to be at extreme risk of violence, and that has got to stop, and we need to do more. Again, as the bishop pointed out, 6 million people. That is numbing, and we need to do more. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any comments you might have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing. The continued and seemingly growing tension between the two nations is deeply concerning and raises a host of questions that must be actively addressed. As we are well aware, instability in the region and numerous accounts of human rights violations reminds us that there is still much to do to protect civilians, including women and children, who have too often endured the unspeakable burden of rape, violence, and injustice. As the chairman has indicated, the UN Group of Experts report to the UN Security Council includes clear evidence that elements of the Rwandan government have been involved in various military activities in the DRC. These activities include Rwanda's direct engagement and support of the armed group M23. On several occasions, the State Department has expressed its deep concern and the need to end violence in eastern DRC and to put an immediate and permanent end to any and all outside support. State has gone on to express its support for regional cooperation against armed groups, including joint military operations. Since the Rwandan genocide, which took the lives of nearly 1 million people, the international community has worked diligently to promote lasting peace and stability, not only in Rwanda, but across the Great Lakes region. This is perhaps exemplified most clearly in the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC and its expanded mandate. We held a hearing last week on peacekeeping in Africa, and certainly we must continue our nation's support of such operations that support sustainable peace. The gravity of the UN's finding attests deeply troubling operations and human rights violations that have endangered or killed countless. One of our witnesses today, I believe, will estimate these killings may well have exceeded 500,000 lives. That's just an unbelievable number. There is no question in my mind that these activities must be brought to an end, and those responsible should be held accountable. The UN report is but one of a growing number of reports on this very issue. Human Rights Watch has conducted extensive research, including having witness accounts that speak to human rights violations and probable war crimes. The witness testimonies of the Human Rights Watch research leaves little doubt that innocent people have been unable to defend themselves. In a recent report, it's my understanding that Human Rights Watch has documented the forced recruitment of over 100 young men and boys by M23 over just the last 6 weeks. Some have been as young as 15 years old. Over the last several months, and in light of the UN report, a number of governments, including our own, have either suspended or delayed financial commitments. Other governments, including Sweden, Germany, the UK, and the Netherlands. While at least one government ultimately released funds for disbursement, donor nations appear to be taking a tougher look at Rwanda's involvement in these matters. While there is still much to learn about the full extent of Rwanda's involvement in these matters, I want to repeat my deep concern. More can and must be done to end support of M23 and other rogue elements operating in the DRC. Number one, want to thank the presenters for coming today and giving your testimony. And before you give your presentation, I just wanted to offer a few questions in your testimony. So what can be understood by reports that M23 aim to cause greater instability and conflict? Is there the belief that this crisis can only be solved through military action, such as the international neutral force recommended by the International Conference on the Great Lakes? And finally, what, in your opinion, are the non-military options that the U.S. and others can employ that can result in a peaceful and sustained end to this testimony? Thank you, to this crisis. Thank you, and I look forward to today's testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bass. It is now our committee's high honor and privilege to welcome Ntambo and Ntanda, the Bishop of the United Methodist in North Katanga Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. As a leader in the church in the Democratic Republic of Congo, he has led the community in responding to the needs of some 30,000 displaced people during Africa's World War in 1998 to 2001, and he negotiated the peace in the Mai Mai militias in North Katanga in 2004. He has served as chancellor of a university and as an interim bishop in Zimbabwe. Bishop Ntanda has also accepted an appointment as senator in the Parliament of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We will then welcome back to our committee a man who is no stranger, Mr. Mark Schneider, who joined the International Crisis Group in spring of 2001 as Senior Vice President and Special Advisor on Latin America. He directs the Washington Advocacy Office, conveying crisis group analyses and recommendations to the White House, the State Department, the Department of Defense, and of course the United States Congress, as well as the World Bank and other international organizations. He also serves as Special Advisor on Latin America and on HIV/AIDS and security. Before joining the International Crisis Group, he served as Director of the Peace Corps and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. And just recently, last fall, he testified before our committee. But again, that friendship and relationship goes back many, many years. So thank you for being here again. We then welcome Mr. Jason Stearns, who is currently with the Rift Valley Institute, who is pursuing a PhD at Yale. He has extensive knowledge working on human rights issues in Central and East Africa. He has spent time in the DRC working as a coordinator for a UN panel that researched rebel groups there and as an analyst for the International Crisis Group in Kenya. Mr. Stearns has also written a well-received book, Dancing in the Glory of Monsters, a history of the Congo Wars of 1996 to 2003, based on extensive interviews with leading protagonists of that conflict. Bishop, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and member of the subcommittee. For the first time, we Congolese will feel be accepted by Americans. Why did we come? We came to seek for your assistance because we know who you are. You have power, you have strong word, and you have all the means to stop the war in Congo. Rwanda is attacking Congo and still attacking Congo. More than 6 million have been killed and still being killed. We came to seek justice because everybody is looking, has a lot of guilty to feel guilty about the 800,000 who have been killed in 1994. But no compassion to Congolese at all. 6 million. No one is paying attention, even having compassion to us. We have come to let you know that we are not against Rwanda. We have no mean at all to hurt, to harm. We have no mean to try to do revenge to Rwandese or to spread hatred between Rwandese and Congolese. But the point we are bringing to you is that Rwanda is killing our people. We want you to make peace, knowing that peace in Congo will be the peace in Rwanda. Yes, America, you have been so blessed to become also a blessing to us as to many nations. Can you stop this war that we can have peace? Can you imagine your own wife having sex relationship before a person you don't know? No. Can you imagine your children, boys and girls, asked to make sex relationship in your front? Can you imagine taking knives and so on, putting in the body of a woman or to cut her? Yes, this is enough. Congo has come to cry. We are facing 911 every day going on. Many cries, many tears, many deaths, many destructions. This is enough. America, you have a power. America, we know. You have a strong voice. And America, we accept. You have all the means to stop that war. Let the justice prevail. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Bishop, for that very, very impassioned appeal to the United States and other countries to step in. Thank you so much, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you and the ranking minority member, Representative Bass, and members of the committee for continuing to focus attention on the cross-border conflict that once again is destroying lives and devastating communities in the Eastern Congo. The International Crisis Group has been reporting on the situation on the ground in the Congo and the Great Lakes for more than a decade. And I'm pleased to share the panel with Jason Stearns, who led our research for many of those years in the DRC. And obviously I'm honored to share the panel with Bishop Ntambo and his eloquent and emotional expression of concern for his people. The Crisis Group is working on a new report that will call for a series of steps that to some degree attempt to respond to Representative Bass's questions. The steps that should be taken at the September 27th summit meeting next week that's been convened by the UN Secretary General, and at the planned October 8th International Conference on Great Lakes Region to bring an immediate end to the violence, to prevent the M23 and other illegal militias from consolidating their territorial control based on their lawlessness and atrocities that began in April, and to sanction Rwanda for its support of the M23 violence. And let's be clear, that violence is essentially motivated by greed and power. It's already produced, since April, nearly 500,000 displaced persons and refugees from the Eastern Congo provinces. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees only a few days ago put out a special appeal for $40 million to try and provide assistance to those displaced persons and refugees. One of the first responses that could be made is to bring together a group to provide relief through the UNHCR to those individuals, humanitarian relief. And I would hope that the administration would take a lead and that the committee could press the administration to take a lead in providing that kind of assistance. Tragically, the M23 militia has been armed, advised, supplied, and supported by elements of the government of Rwanda and Rwandan Defense Forces. According to UN experts, NGOs, diplomats, and including, as the committee has noted, the representatives of the U.S. government who have made that same appeal. The support must end once and for all. We believe the following steps should be taken. An immediate ceasefire to be monitored by MONUSCO, by the United Nations Stabilization Mission in the Congo. A full end to foreign support to armed groups, particularly an end to Rwandan support of M23. And as you've noted, there have been some sanctions on assistance, but if necessary, expanding those sanctions. And that would include by adding names to the UN sanctions list of any individuals and entities responsible for supporting the M23, including Rwandan officials if they're found to be supporting the M23. Third, the arrest of Bosco Ntaganda and his transfer to the International Criminal Court. Fourth, a request to the ICC to investigate the M23 and other armed groups, especially regarding war crimes violations, child soldiers recruitment, what you've heard, rapes, and other violations. The full disarmament and demobilization of M23. And something that has been called for several years ago, that is a joint mechanism for border verification to end the incursions across the border, and an assessment of what has been done and what has not been done by both sides in terms of implementing the March 23, 2009 agreement. Mr. Chairman, if it sounds to you like deja vu, you're unfortunately correct. The only difference from what has gone on in the recent past is that the United States and other governments and the UN have finally gone public in telling the Rwandan government that it must end its support for militias in the Congo. If we had a time machine, we could go back to 2008, when the CNDP led a rebellion against the government in North Kivu, defeated the Congolese army, and made a mockery of a force of peacekeepers with the support of Rwanda. During that Goma crisis, Laurent Nkulu was running the CNDP. But in fact, we don't need a time machine because it's happening again. And many of the same characteristics have existed this time around. What sparked the events since April appear to be that in March, President Kabila ordered the arrest of General Bosco Ntaganda, who would replace Nkunda as head of the CNDP. Ntaganda had been integrated into the Congolese armed forces, despite his being indicted for war crimes by the ICC. In fact, it was never a real integration. It was a fraudulent integration, because Ntaganda kept both command and control of the CNDP as a full unit within the FARDC, and CNDP kept control of illicit mineral exploitation. Once the word leaked that Kabila wanted him arrested, Ntaganda defected from the army and took to the bush with several hundred soldiers. He then joined another renegade CNDP army officer, and the group took the name M23 in reference to the March 23, 2009 agreement, as you've noted. However, it wasn't the lack of respect for the March 23 agreement. It was the threat of arrest of Ntaganda, as well as their desire to maintain control over illicit economic operations in eastern Congo, defending the business interests and networks established by the CNDP and perpetuated even after they'd integrated into the Congolese armed forces. The failure to dismantle the CNDP command structure when the troops were incorporated into the FARDC allowed them to fester and allowed them to continue illicit control over local resources. Since April, they've conquered large chunks of territory in North Kivu and are now administering them. That rebel group is financing itself through coercive taxation of supply trucks going to Goma. The government's weak response to the challenge has resulted in FARDC officers defecting in South Kivu, but also in Province Oriental and Kasai Occidental. And deep in rural areas, other armed groups are taking advantage of the tactical situation and expanding their own control and committing their own abuses. Unfortunately, despite calls in the past from the European Union, Belgium, the United States, and others, Kinshasa simply remains unwilling to reform its own army. And in the most recent instance, has again begun to forge alliance with its own militias. And as in the past, Rwanda is denying any allegations of involvement. And I think it's important to stress, Mr. Chairman, that the evidence of Rwandan official support for the M23 is overwhelming. And I'm going to quote just a couple of statements from the UN Group of Experts addendum that was released in June, in which it said, and I quote, "The group has gathered overwhelming evidence demonstrating that senior RDF officers in their official capacities have been backstopping the rebels through providing weapons, military supplies, and new recruits." It goes on to say, "Through such arms embargo violations, Rwandan officials have also been in contravention of the sanctions regime's travel ban and assets freeze measures by including 3 designated individuals among their direct allies. Since the earliest stages of its inception, the group documented a systematic pattern of military and political support provided to the M23 rebellion by Rwandan authorities." And let me add that the rapes, the extrajudicial executions, and forced recruitment by the M23 over recent months has been described in a series of reports, and most recently, as you noted, by Human Rights Watch. Continued support by Rwandan authorities raises questions clearly of their complicity in those international law violations. And I think it's also unfortunately important to be clear that one element in the current crisis is the blatant military ineffectiveness of the Congolese armed forces. Internal infighting, corruption, delinquency, the total lack of professionalism essentially allowed 700 poorly armed and trained rebels to defeat now for more than 5 months a government army of thousands of troops trained by several countries, including the U.S., and an 18,000 member UN force charged with backing up the DRC army and helping them prevent violations of civilian lives, has simply failed to carry out that obligation. The measures that I outlined earlier can be seen as a conflict management approach to deal with the current crisis. However, these are stopgap actions. What has to occur is the implementation of the 2009 agreement, an end to Rwandan government support for proxies in eastern Congo, and key governance reforms in the DRC that simply have not occurred. Starting with the holding of credible provincial and local elections, decentralization, and action in the fight against corruption. They obviously are critical. And if the Western nations, including the U.S., want to move from crisis management to conflict resolution in the Great Lakes region, they have to speak with a single clear voice and exert direct political pressure on both Kinshasa and Kigali to take the immediate steps that I've outlined, as well as to commit to long-term governance reforms that are essential. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schneider, thank you so very much for your testimony, for your very specific recommendations and analyses that hopefully the administration, the Congress are listening. We certainly are, and we will do our level best to follow up with very specific recommendations. So thank you so much. Mr. Stearns.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, thank you very much for this opportunity today. I'm based in the Eastern DRC, so I've been following the situation very closely there. The current crisis, beginning with the rise of the new M23 rebellion, is the result of the failure of the Congolese peace process to deal with the persistent causes of conflict in the region. While there are no easy fixes to these deep-rooted challenges, and this is very much along the lines of what my two colleagues here said before, a lasting solution will require significant change in how the U.S. government engages with Rwanda, but also for Kinshasa to initiate a political process to get out of the present impasse. As you know, in early April, a mutiny spread across army camps in the eastern Congo, led by former officers of the CNDP rebellion, who had been integrated into the National Army in 2009. This mutiny draws on three main sources of instability. Its officers claimed, first of all, that they suffered from ethnic discrimination, that the Tutsi community, from which most of them come, was the victim of persecution. Now, there is no doubting the prevalence and, unfortunately, the vitriol of anti-Tutsi sentiment in parts of the Congo. However, this legitimate grievance has also been manipulated. From the beginning, the mutineers have received support from the Rwandan government and local politicians who worry that the dismantling of CNDP networks in the eastern Congo would jeopardize their businesses, their personal security, and control over local politics. This is the second factor fueling the current morass: elites employing armed force to preserve their interests. The final source of insecurity is the Congolese state itself. Its crippling weakness reinforces the belief that the only way of protecting property and individual freedoms is through armed force. The Congolese state has neither the rule of law to guarantee property rights, nor the force of law to suppress armed rivals. These weak institutions are perhaps the most intractable part of the current conundrum. Well, the mutiny initially failed, with the majority of those having defected from the National Army returning within days and over a dozen of the ringleaders arrested. The remaining mutineers fled to a small stretch of hills bordering Rwanda. That was around mid-April. It was then that the Rwandan government's interference and involvement became acute. They intervened to prevent Kinshasa from crushing this mutiny. Over the following months, Rwanda supplied weapons, equipment, helped M23 recruit hundreds of soldiers, and several occasions sent whole Rwandan army units across the border in support. Let me be clear. As Mark said just before me, there is no doubt about Rwandan involvement. It has been documented by a United Nations report released in June by Human Rights Watch and by our own researchers. In response to this evidence, donors have suspended around $90 million in aid to Rwanda, as well as $200,000 from the U.S. government, as you know. Despite this, the situation has not improved. Rwanda has continued to support the M23 even after the suspension of aid and even after the UN report, including by sending troops to Rutshuru, to take the town of Rutshuru, which is near the Ugandan border, in early July. So, what is the way out of this impasse? And I'm going to start perhaps addressing some of the questions you raised, but I'll finish that probably in the question and answer period. The neutral force that you mentioned, unfortunately, I don't think it has much of a future, and I think actually it could be a waste of time in the sense that we're pursuing a track that's not going to go anywhere. So far, the U.S. government, along with other major donors, has reprimanded Kigali and condemned the mutiny. That's been the main response. But I'd like to highlight that such criticism of Rwanda is, on its own, not a solution, and will only enhance the defiant rhetoric coming out of Kigali. So while pressure on Rwanda must be increased as it continues to play a pivotal role in supporting the mutiny, it will not be effective unless it is part of a larger peace plan. In other words, pushing Rwanda in itself, bashing Rwanda is not a solution in itself. This political deal that must be initiated should strike a tricky balance, and it really is a tricky balance, between giving Kigali a way out and allowing Kinshasa to significantly dilute, if not completely dismantle, the CNDP networks in the Eastern Congo. Why is this? Why must there be a political deal? Well, the Congolese army, as Mark pointed out before me, cannot defeat the M23 with military might alone. And unfortunately, that's been clear in the battles that have been fought so far. Sooner or later, a deal will have to be struck with the mutineers. An acceptable outcome of this deal would include the arrest of the worst offenders within the M23, including Bosco Ntaganda, who's wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court, and the reintegration of other officers and troops into the army, but redeployed elsewhere in the country. At the same time, the Congolese government should reach out to reassure its rivals. This includes helping refugees in neighboring Rwanda return home. There's around 50,000 Congolese Tutsi refugees in neighboring Rwanda, and setting an inquiry up on abuses committed by all sides since the mutiny began in April. A more difficult compromise could be to consider allowing Rwandan troops to continue to deploy small units and joint operations in the Eastern Congo against the FDLR, albeit with significant safeguards. Now, the only way this kind of deal can work is if Rwanda plays a part. This means reformulating the kind of pressure we put on Kigali, from asking them to stop providing support to the M23, an outcome that's very difficult to measure, you're measuring an absence of something, to become an active part of a solution. The Rwandan government could, for example, allow the Congolese government and the United Nations to deploy troops along its border with M23 territory. It has a long stretch of border through which the support passes, as well as arrest key leaders of the mutiny, many of whom are based in Rwanda. You can just cross the border from where I live in the Eastern Congo to Rwanda and visit many of these people in their houses in Rwanda. This kind of deal will require strong and sustained pressure on Kigali. Donors, chief amongst them the United States, will have some hard choices to make. They can no longer see Rwanda's admirable successes in healthcare, education, and peacekeeping, and they are admirable successes, as separate from its interference in the Eastern Congo. Different kinds of pressure, including sanctions against individuals, suspension of military training, should be considered. I would also like to note that the United States government does not present a united front on this account, and this has also allowed, I think, the Rwandan government to take advantage of these internal differences within the U.S. government. The measures I have outlined are a short-term fix. In order to address root causes and prevent future violence, there will need to be much more far-reaching reforms. How can Rwanda and Rwanda's local allies in the Eastern Congo be persuaded that they do not need to support armed groups in order to protect their interests? How can the Congolese state overcome inertia and vested interest to reform its decrepit state apparatus? These are the most fundamental questions policymakers need to address for the long term. These are not solutions, however, that should be imposed by outsiders like us. An African option would be, for example, a high-level expert panel like the Mbeki panel on Sudan, with an African Union mandate to pursue both short and long-term solutions. This is part of the political process that I mentioned before that needs to be revived. This could revive the international community's political engagement with the conflict, which has lacked coherence and focus since the end of the transition in 2006. To conclude, the situation in the Eastern Congo is indeed bleak, but this latest crisis is also an opportunity to change the way the outside world engages with this region and to address some of the structural problems that have caused these crises to recur with tragic regularity. As a matter of moral consistency, the United States government cannot continue to help fund the Rwandan national budget on the one hand, and at the same time continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to stabilize the Eastern Congo. Thank you for your time and opportunity to present today. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Stearns. Just to begin the questioning, let me begin with Bishop Ntanda. When you presented your petition to the United Nations, could you tell us what the response was from UN officials, and especially since obviously our government is what we need to be focused even more on? Your delegation met with the U.S. officials during your visit, and what was their response? Did they give any feedback as to what they might do to mitigate this violence?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say that this initiative is not Ntambo. This was the initiative of all church leaders in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including civil society. And second, we didn't come to defend Congolese government. We are not Congolese government agency. This is totally in freedom of church initiative, church leaders, as well as civil society. Well, we had a chance to come as a church to express our cry, to express our deep depression. When you hear me, my point is people are dying, every day going. Even September 11 passed, I got a telephone call from one girl from Goma. I wanted to say hello when I was here in America. She just expressed a feeling. She said, well, Bishop, they just shot my uncle. I can give you the name. I can give you the telephone number. They just shot my uncle. This last September 11. Yes, we visited a United Nations. The response was, you need to go to talk to great powers. I mean, United States, British, France, Russia, and all the members of United Nations to focus to stop this war. They are the ones who have the power in their hand and who can solve this problem. United Nations General Secretary, by himself, he can't really solve the problem. It needs to be united. It needs the voice from the members of United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could, Bishop, you testified that women who have been raped in Eastern Congo are rejected by their husbands and society.
Oh, excuse me. Excuse me, Chair.
Yes.
Yes, we visited United States.
Right.
We visited Canada. Some of them, we were 32 delegates. Sorry to take you back. All the European countries, I mean Belgium, France, Germany, Britain, all over the world, including African countries, the church leaders went to express the same feeling and asking the same assistance. Stop the war in Congo. Thank you.
What was the response from the U.S. government? What did they say they would do?
Yes, when we met State Department, I wish if he was here. I know. They really regretted. They really regretted. And they expressed their feeling that they are going to work through. But what we have come to you is the Congress has the voice. The Congress can listen to us. We don't like to put in those things in political side. Congo government has done what he can do. Can you imagine you are asked to assist someone? The United Nations asked to assist them when the war started in '94. Congo opened the door. Now, instead of United Nations feeling its responsibility to take out refugees, this problem is Rwanda's problem. Once Rwanda stopped the war in Congo, Once the Rwanda is required to maintain democracy in his own country, once the Rwanda will accept these people who fled to Congo to bring them so they can have dialogue, we will end this war. The international community can put everything they want to Congolese. We did all we could do. We have passion to 800,000, compassion to 800,000 who died. We cried. We opened the door. But today, Rwanda is giving back. We showed love, but they show crime to us. It's so deep. International community, we ask to stop this war. We didn't come to do politics here. We came to share the truth that the war is going till today. Can you stop this war so peace can prevail between Rwanda and the Congolese? We Rwandese are not our enemies. Every day going on our border, you see children of Rwanda crossing, coming to Congo. You see Congolese crossing, going to Rwanda to buy food and so on. But it's the top. So this is the way we need to say, please, can you stop this war? Can you stop killings in our area? Human life is more important than minerals. Thank you very much.
Let me ask Mr. Schneider or Mr. Stearns might want to speak to this as well. The U.S. does have a significant point of leverage with Rwanda through the World Bank multilateral aid, $135 million in general budget support to Rwanda. We are the major contributor to it. And it's a blank check because it's not like it's dedicated to alleviating poverty. It really goes to stabilize their government. Could you speak to what we need to be doing on the economic side to turn, to use that leverage effectively?
I think there's no question that the United States needs to make it quite clear to the governor of Rwanda that one of the conditions for our relationship has to be an end to support for the illegal armed groups in the Eastern Congo. That has to be clear. And I think that there needs to be specific steps. Rwanda needs to accept the kind of joint verification of the border that we called for. It needs to remove its own troops, and needs to allow the MONUSCO to, at the very least, to set up mechanisms for verification against cross-border support. And those need to be conditions of our relationship. One expression of that relationship relates to budget support. I would hope that the U.S. would make quite clear that if Rwanda continues this kind of support for the M23, that this is going to have to be reviewed, and that together with the Congress, that it's unlikely that you're going to see continued support, open-ended support.
If I could just address that as well, I think a couple of different things. The number one commodity the Rwandan government cares about is his reputation. So symbolic pressure can actually go a long way with the Rwandan government. If Rwandan government today attracts Starbucks and Rick Warren and Tony Blair, it's not because it's such a great economic opportunity. It's because people see it as a symbolic beacon of hope in Central Africa. That storyline needs to change, if you will, and the U.S. government can help change that storyline as well. As I said before, the Rwandan government has made enormous progress internally on development indicators, but that can't be separated, as it has been so far, from its involvement in the Eastern Congo. The second thing I would point out, and this is really just to agree with Mark, is that despite the defiant rhetoric coming out of Kigali, they are very sensitive to financial pressures as well. In 2002, it was the simple abstention of the U.S. government from a vote in the International Monetary Fund on a credit facility. They didn't even turn it down. They just abstained from voting. That put significant pressure on the Rwandan government to withdraw its troops in 2002. And they did. They withdrew their troops immediately after that. Not to say that was the only reason, but just to say that things like that, I think, can go a long way. Now, we have yet to see what's going to happen later this year. The UN Group of Experts' final report's going to come out in November. And all of these countries that suspended their aid have to decide on whether they're going to disperse their aid or not. All they've done is suspend their aid. But I do think that raising those issues at the level of the World Bank is going to be important, especially because the U.S. government itself provides no budgetary aid to the Rwandan government. It just works through programs. And we don't want to cut HIV/AIDS funding through PEPFAR and other things.
Let me ask you, what is it?
Could I just make one other point? and that is that in the next several weeks, there's going to be an opportunity for President Obama to speak to President Kagame at the summit in New York. Secretary Clinton, presumably as well, will have the opportunity to speak with President Kagame at the General Assembly. It seems that this kind of demand for an end to support for M23 needs to be made at that level.
Can I ask you, what has the administration done? Has it really stepped up to the plate? You mentioned earlier, since April, 500,000 people displaced, and of course, that's in addition to those who have been slaughtered or raped. Mm-hmm. But 500,000, that is a huge number of dislocated people who are then vulnerable not just to the elements, but to further bloodshed and exploitation.
I think that there's no question that there's been an increase in humanitarian assistance. The point, though, is that the UN, in its most recent appeal, has indicated that it still requires additional support for those displaced persons and refugees. And as I say, I think that needs to be, the U.S. should take a leadership role in that. I should add that there's no question, as you know, that there have already been communications and concerns expressed by the U.S. government at the highest level to the government of Rwanda. But at this point, this is the point where they need to cease assistance to the M23. And to be frank, I don't think we can wait till the end of the year. Right. The kind of reports that the bishop has just described, those reports are horrendous, and the violations need to cease.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add to that, and this sort of, I think, reinforces Mark's point that this needs to be taken to a higher level. The response, the U.S. government suspended cut $200,000 in military aid, but that wasn't even really a response. That was a trigger in a law. They had to do that. They didn't have a choice. Otherwise, they haven't done very much in terms of aid suspension or cutting because they don't want to cut programs. They go to poor people in Rwanda. There have been several phone calls been put in, but I'd like to highlight the fact that on numerous occasions, President Kagame has not picked up the phone when Assistant Secretary of State Carson has called him. There was a phone call put in by an Undersecretary of State, but in recent months, I'm not aware of the fact that the Secretary of State has actually had any contact with him. So the mood in Kigali, where I just was a couple of days ago, at least from some members of the Rwandan government, is we can weather this out. The British government just disbursed at least part of the funding that they had suspended, and they feel the tide is swinging in their favor. So I think that, as Mark said before, the point needs to be hammered home that the eyes of the international community, and particularly the United States government, are on them.
Which is precisely why we have convened this hearing. Bishop?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the concern, as well the expression of church leaders and church society. If you are willing, I can read to you, please. In order to prevent the situation from escalating further and ensure the armed groups and the militias persist, we propose the following concrete measure. 1, condemn Rwanda for its support to the armed groups. In this regard, we ask it to all permanent members of United Security Council not to accept the candidacy of Rwanda as a permanent member of United Security Council. 2, support the proposed international force necessary to secure the border between the DRC Congo and its neighbors in the east, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and gives this force a mandate to use force in order to eradicate all negative forces which are active in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. 3, support the DDR process. 4, engage in ECC in the prosecution of the Rwandese leadership because of its insurgery in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And finally, support the process of reforming the DRC security sector by building a strong military and police. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just ask a couple of final questions and just point that Ms. Bass had to leave for a family emergency, so she wanted me to convey to you that she is absolutely interested in what we're doing here. It's a matter of she had to run home. So I just want you to know that. The UN group of experts identified several individuals in the Rwandan government as being directly involved in ADM 23, most notably the Rwandan Minister of Defense. What is being done to sanction, to hold them to account individually, not just collectively as a group, but individually for breaching those sanctions?
I think that what has to happen is that information from the UN group of experts has to be brought to the Sanctions Committee, and actually the report will go to the Security Council, and then they have to make a judgment.
So that'll be in November?
Yes.
I just to add on that point, because the UN group of experts, I think, is the key sort of fulcrum, if you will, of pressure on Rwanda at the moment. In response to the addendum that came out in June, the Rwandan government has launched a full-scale campaign of undermining the credibility of the group of experts, including calling the coordinator of the group of experts a genocide ideologue. It's a smear campaign, and I don't think anybody has really bought into this a whole lot, but it will be, there are some signs that members of the Security Council will try to undermine the group of experts because of this. The group of experts is a key tool, not only for Rwanda, but around the world. These groups of experts are a vital tool for diplomacy. So I would just also highlight the importance of the final report of the group of experts who have done a very rigorous job in the region in terms of documenting these abuses.
Ms. Stearns, you mentioned, at least if I heard it correctly, that you didn't think the neutral group had much of an expectation that it could do something. I would note that only Tanzania has pledged troops. Could you maybe elaborate on that, why you think that's a non-starter?
I think two main issues, staffing and funding, but also the mandate. It's a neutral force, so by definition, you have to have countries that are not involved in the conflict, and they have to be African countries. So already that reduces the number of countries that can contribute. You know, I'd like to note that the UN peacekeeping mission has always had a terrible time getting troops to participate in much less risky operations than this one. The mandate, at least according to the ICGLR, the regional grouping, would have to be offensive military operations against the M23 and the FDLR in extremely difficult terrain. So who would staff this? You pointed out only Tanzania has come forward. Who would fund this? Donors are already funding a 1.4 billion annual budget for the UN peacekeeping mission. According to the donors at least I spoke to, including the US government, there's no real will to fund another military mission that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year, there's no doubt. And would they get the mandate to do this? I'm sure you could find African countries to deploy troops to do very little, to do observation, but that's what the UN peacekeeping mission does. So I think for various reasons, I'm skeptical. I would also add that because of these negotiations, there's been a lull in the fighting, which is great. But this has also offered the opportunity for the M23 that just started off with 700 troops, so they had a serious manpower problem, to continue recruiting. Their main challenge was manpower. Over the last 3 or 4 months, they've been able to recruit probably over 1,000 new troops. So this lull in the fighting is not only may not lead anywhere, it may actually further M23's aims.
Let me just ask, MONUSCO's rules of engagement, you know, when I was in Goma in January of 2008, I had extensive talks with the commanders and talked to a lot of the troops, as well as those who were investigating sexual crimes committed by the peacekeepers themselves, and held a number of hearings about that terrible, terrible, ugly exploitation of little 12 and 13-year-old girls. But that said, what about the rules of engagement? Why is a relatively small but seemingly agile and highly intense group of people, M23, able to thwart government troops and MONUSCO?
I think that's one of the questions that we have as well, Mr. Chairman. It appears to be, at the very least, more a question of political will than of legal authority in our view. That is that the mandate to protect civilians and support the FARDC troops in doing that would seem to provide sufficient authority that where you have an illegal rebellion of an armed force that carries out rape and extrajudicial executions, that force legitimately should be countered and acted on using whatever means are necessary by MONUSCO in support of the FARDC forces. And the answer right now is that they have not taken those actions to directly go after the M23. And I would argue that their mandate is, in rules of engagement, are sufficient to do that.
Chairman, one of the problems is that, and Mark just mentioned that, there's two parts of the mandate that are relevant here. There's protection of civilians in imminent danger, but there's also support to the Congolese army. They emphasize the latter and not the former. In other words, they conduct operations in support of the Congolese army. They do not conduct on their own offensive operations against any of these forces. And they are frustrated, obviously, by the incapacities of the Congolese army itself. So I think that...
and again, that's an old story.
And that's a very old story. I mean, we're getting back to a problem that I used to work for the UN peacekeeping mission, and even when I was there, we tried to get our troops to deploy aggressively, and they say, we didn't come to the Congo to be sent home in body bags, was their answer. So that's a whole other can of worms probably to open up, but I think that point probably should be reiterated as often as possible.
Bishop Ntanda, if you could just, in your testimony, you noted that women who have been raped in eastern Congo are rejected by their husbands in society. On my trip there, I went to Heal Africa and met with a number, it was a faith-based initiative to try to help women, and it provides other health care as well. But women who have been so abused, and I know there are other faith-based initiatives as well. What impact has organizations like Heal Africa in Goma had on helping those women? I was awed by how women who had been so horrifically abused had smiles on their face, had a sense of hope, had a resiliency and a courage that was otherworldly. It was so strong. And I think the faith component certainly is a major contributor to that, because they do find healing, and they realize that they've been victimized. They had nothing, whatsoever to do with it, but their husbands. What is being done to try to get them to realize that the exploitation, stand by your victimized wife? Could you elaborate on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I don't know that organization.
Okay.
I wish. But the point is, the rape of a woman, she will be rejected by her own husband. It's like you have committed adultery. I don't like you. It's not just rejected by her husband, rejected by the clan. No one will accept her. Imagine such woman affected in her body, rejected by her own family. She has no way to go. And it looks like the humanity has rejected her. It's so painful to her. Not even that. There is some women who get pregnant and have, children. And those children are not accepted in the family. And those children, they don't know where to go, which means the father, the mother, and the baby are all rejected. All those atrocities is brought to us because of a war. We didn't have such kind of culture in our system, but it was a consequence of a war. This is why we project to finish that war. We need to know to come to the source. The trouble in Rwanda. Rwanda has to be responsible to his own people, not to bring war to Congo. Once we have peace, I think we will be able to deal with our own problem inside. In fact, when the lady is rejected, probably, with this kind of talk we got from here, we will find the traditional ways to take care of her and of the baby. Concerning the organization, I'm so sorry, Mr. Chair, I don't know them, and I wish if I knew them I could speak about concerning them.
Let me just ask one final question, and then any other points you might want to take, please do. We had a hearing earlier this year focused on the killing fields in North Kivos and that area. And some of our witnesses made a point that everyone seems to know about Sudan and Darfur, and yet in an area in a region where some 6 million people have been slaughtered, there still remains an incredible ignorance and a lack of focus and even understanding as to what's going on. I can't figure it out. I'm wondering if perhaps you could convey to us what we could do to, we even invited Ben Affleck, who's been very visible in his efforts to bring attention to the killing fields there, and he noted that as well, that he has made it his mission to try to bring visibility to this, because visibility hopefully leads to governments taking more bolder action, because in my opinion we have been very weak and ineffective, even though we've done some things. It has not been at the top of the agenda, which is why I asked the bishop earlier about what the response was from U.S. government officials at the Department of State in terms of what they want to do, next steps, which is why we had hoped that, you know, Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson and our guest would have been here. We do have an open invitation, as I said earlier, to them, because we want to ask the tough questions. But why are we asking tough questions? Because people are dying and they're being displaced as the killing fields continue. So why are so many people unaware of what's going on there? Mr. Schneider?
You know, I really don't have a good answer for that. I mean, you would think that after the nearly decade, more than a decade-long, 15 years of continuing conflict, that it would be much higher on the public agenda internationally. With the level of just human tragedy, you would think that the media would have focused more attention on continuing attention on it. I think the problem is the recurrence, that people don't see. They focused on it, they thought it ended, and then it happens all over again. And there's just so much bandwidth, and unfortunately, it just has not remained high on anyone's agenda.
The curse of the Congo War has been its complexity. You know, if you can't understand something or soundbite it or fit it into some easily encapsulated interest, you could say, it's difficult to make people care about it. What is the Congo War about? You can see already it's difficult. It's about, you know, 17 different acronyms and 18 different actors and about 16 years of history or hundreds of years of history. So because of the difficulty to encapsulate the war, it makes it much more difficult to care about. I think that's a key problem. That doesn't make it an excuse or a pretext not to do something, but I think that's a key challenge for all of us, for journalists, for politicians, for advocates, everything. I think in terms of how to get out of here, I think that there's some things we can do in the short term we can do a lot more. We've mentioned many of them today. I think there are many very intractable parts of the situation that are going to be difficult to solve. And I think, you know, for example, creating a strong central Congolese state that would be able to deal with groups like the M23, even with Rwandan support. As Mark pointed out, they've thrown, you know, thousands of troops against this small rebellion and they haven't been able to defeat it. Reconstructing a strong Congolese state is going to take decades, unfortunately. Now, we can help much more than we have in the past, but I think that's one of the main conundrums. How to get out of this sort of impasse in the short term, just to sort of summarize some of the things that we mentioned today, I think that there needs to be a political process that's going. I don't have a faith in the military solution. I don't see either the Congolese government or an outside military solution being imposed. In other words, there needs to be a political process in which the Rwandan government will have to play an active part, which means pressure on them, but also means considering them as a partner in this process. The outcome is going to have to be the arrest of top M23 leaders, but the reintegration of a majority of them into the Congolese army, but deployed elsewhere. That's one of the key demands of the government, and I think in this case it makes a lot of sense. I think in terms of the U.S. government, they have to get their ducks in a row to a certain extent. We have, you know, different agencies and different players saying different things. When the UN Group of Experts report was submitted to the UN Security Council in June, the U.S. government blocked it initially. And not because the U.S. government's policy was to block the report, but because individuals within the U.S. government did not think it was productive in the long term. And this is result of disagreements within the U.S. government. So I fully encourage your initiatives to ask tough questions to the U.S. government, because I think that the higher this goes up in terms of the priorities, the fewer the disagreements will be. In part, it's because it's such a low priority that disagreements like this are able to break out. And I think that finally, as I said before, the U.S. government needs to take a tough look at its financial and political engagement in the region. As I said before, we can't minimize the progress that Rwanda has made since the genocide. It's made fantastic progress. It's it carried out amazing innovations in health and education. But then to sort of hermetically separate that from what's going on in the Eastern Congo doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's been a problem that we faced over the last 15 or 16 years, to make people understand that here in Washington. So I think, just to summarize, that's not a panacea for what's going on, but there's definitely some ideas there for what can be done here in Washington.
Could I, Mr. Chairman? You mentioned what is being done in terms of trying to provide some assistance to the women. And I think that USAID is providing assistance to a variety of programs that you've seen. I was on a panel with Dr. Mukwege and the Panzi Hospital, and providing support there. But much more needs to be done. But the critical thing is ending the rapes going forward. And that means dealing with this problem of illegal armed groups and FARDC not under sufficient control in the Eastern Congo. And with respect to that, I think that you do have to ask yourself whether this can be done solely by looking at how do we stop the current violence. What we need to be asking is, how do we get to a point where the DRC government is more effective, more stable? And it seems to me there we have to go back to the question of post-electoral dynamics, and we have to ask the question of what are we doing as a government, international community, in trying to ensure that the flaws that occurred in the previous election don't continue, and that the next round of provincial and local elections are much more credible. We have to go back to the question of security sector reform and the rule of law. And we have to look at what is being done and ask ourselves what more can be done in the future. And finally, with respect to MONUSCO, we called for an internal audit of MONUSCO's role in the past, and we think that that should be done now with respect to MONUSCO's response to the M23 mutiny, if you will, and then to ask what it should be doing with respect to the dual mandate of protection of civilians and support for the Congolese armed forces. And finally, I agree with Jason with respect to the internal advances on the development side in Rwanda. But let's not forget there are also limitations with respect to democratic reforms inside Rwanda as well, along with the cross-border activities that need to cease. We need governance reforms on both sides of the border, and we need an end to illegal actions that promote violence across the border as well. Thank you.
Mr. Stearns, you mentioned a moment ago about the initial blocking of the UN report by the U.S. What grade would you give the Obama administration in terms of handling the M23 crisis? I mean it because, going forward, we're all hopeful. We all want things to change. But we really have to be honest and very tough as to whether or not we have done enough. What grade?
It's a great. I would give them A for apathy.
Okay.
It's and not sort of connote any sort of degree of excellence by A. The key problem the U.S. government has had is apathy. It's not that they've done the wrong things; it's that they haven't done anything at all. As I said before, there will always be internal disagreements within the U.S. government with regards to different issues. But it's because it's at such a low level of priority that you shouldn't have the U.S. delegation to the Security Council saying one thing and then State Department saying something else, which is what happens when the support report was submitted to the UN Security Council. So I think that I don't think that, speaking to people at State Department, they have good ideas, they're smart people, they're engaged, but it's not a high level enough priority to deal with. So the response has largely been spend a lot of money on it, but don't allocate the necessary political will. We spend a lot of money on the region, and I think actually that money is compromised by the fact that we don't engage politically enough. And so you have this paradox with the fact that A country like Rwanda is 50% of its budget almost is financed by foreign aid. In the Congo, it's exactly the same thing. And yet, when you go to Kigali or Kinshasa, you hear diplomats, they're wringing their hands and saying, but we don't have any leverage. So how do you don't have any leverage, even though you're financing them to the tune of 50% of their budget? It's because it's not a political priority for anybody. In most of these countries, policy is set to a certain extent, to a large extent, by the ambassadors themselves, because it just doesn't rise high enough on the flagpole here in Washington. So, I would say the Obama administration has not been engaged enough. Rather than doing the wrong things, it just hasn't done very much at all.
Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh.
I was really wondering, and thank you for the question, why it took so long to solve this problem of 6 million. This is why we came to you as someone from emergency. Why so long? The people who were able to take steps, they didn't. I think Congress has to take steps now. This is your time. Yes, this is Congress, your time. We can go around politics. We can condemn the government and so on, but people are dying. This is our concern. And Congress, in your hand, you have the salvation of all Congolese people. You are the one who will build a strong wall between Rwanda and the Congo, a wall of peace, a wall of love, a wall of justice. We beg to you, you can do something. Thank you very much. And at the end, we will never allow to lose even 1 inch of our country. In other words, we will never accept balkanization of our country. We remain united as United States has been united after September 11. You were as one nation to fight the enemy, and we will remain as one nation to fight, but we can bring peace, we can bring love, we can bring justice between the two nations. God bless.
If I could, the one thing I don't want to have a misapprehension. There's no question that there have been high-level interagency focus by this administration on the DRC and on the Great Lakes region. They had a previous special envoy who you knew quite well, late Harold Wolpe. They have a current one. The problem, it seems to me, is that with respect to this particular instance, it seems to me that it has not drawn enough of a continuing high-level engagement so that the answer to your question is incomplete. And that's really what we need to see now, is more activity directly at the highest levels in order to make it clear that there has to be an end to cross-border support for the M23, and the M23 simply has got to be dismantled through a political process or a military process. And probably it'll require both. At least the threat of a military element is going to be necessary.
For a question, our African specialist on the subcommittee, Greg Simpkins, who was actually in the region as far back as 1998, and yield to Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back then in '98, right before the war started, I was quite clear that the problem of cross-border raids into Rwanda was very serious. And this is the reason that the Rwandans give for intervening, although we have issues with the way they've done it. A lot of suggestions have been made for how we deal with this. Is there any strategy that you've seen that you think will work to finally put an end to these cross-border raids so that there's no reason for the Rwandans to intervene? You said the neutral force probably is not going to work. We still have MONUSCO there, which is, I believe, 2,000 troops under its mandated level. There is still a Congo army. What means is there available to finally bring an end to these raids?
I think that, ironically, the best way, the most successful approach has been joint operations between the Congolese government and the Rwandan army. This was the 2009 peace deal that integrated the CNDP into the Congolese army, brought about joint operations between those two countries. Now, those joint operations had terrible humanitarian side effects. I wouldn't call them side effects, consequences that I would never underestimate. But the fact of the matter is that the FDLR that had been carrying out these cross-border raids has been hit extremely hard in the last 3 years. In the last 3 years, they've probably lost between 60 and 70% of their troops. They are now currently estimated to be probably not more than 1,000 to 2,000 troops. So compare that with 6,000 to 7,000 back in 2008. Even according to Rwandan security officials in private, when I speak to them, they almost laugh. They say that these people are not, they still have the capacity to carry out terrorist attacks into Rwanda. And I think that is still a concern of the Rwandan government, especially against installations. But, the last serious attack they carried out into Rwanda was in 2001. So it's been 11 years since any serious number of these people crossed the border and carried out an attack. Since then, you've had great grenade attacks, some of them which are probably carried out by FDLR troops, some of them not. But the FDLR as such is a dying organization. There's no doubt about that. But ironically, it was this peace deal that had brought about that. And ironically, again, if there has been any respite to the FDLR, it's these new attacks. The FDLR is a mercenary organization, so they breed on insecurity. They are there at the moment praying that the Congolese government will reach out to them because the Congolese government's now fallen out with the Rwandan government. So I think that in terms of how to go forward in the future, I think that, as I said before, if the Rwandan government really is motivated, and I don't think it's solely motivated by the FDLR, but that's certainly a consideration, then the Congolese government should consider to allow the Rwandan government to continue joint operations against the FDLR in its territory. The Rwandan government, up to early this year, had 2 companies of special forces deployed on Congolese territory. And that's something they could consider to continue doing. But I think that the FDLR as such, as an organization, is on its last legs.
I mean, I think that if you need to have, in a sense, a renewal of the previous political agreement, but it's going to require additional pressure on both Kigali and Kinshasa. And I think that an element of that has got to be finally an agreement for this cross-border verification against cross-border incursions, both ways. And that's where it seems to me as well that MONUSCO needs to play a stronger role than it has in the past.
Well, thank you very much. You can look at UN report. I think we will have the correct answer to this. Rwanda is arming Hutus, militias, sending them back to Congo in order to justify its presence for economic reason with coltan. I think the best one, we can receive a very good response to that, is the UN report in your hand. Rwanda is playing all kinds of games to hide himself, to justify himself. I think UN report is clear. We will find the correct answer from there, please.
Thank you very much. I would say to our very distinguished witnesses, you have given us a clear blueprint. Hopefully the administration is listening as well. We will follow up very aggressively, which is why we had the hearing in the first place, to really get your take. If you have any final words or any comments you'd like to convey to the committee before we adjourn.
No, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do think that it would be useful during these next several days, given the sessions that are taking place at the UN next week and 2 weeks after that in the region, to make clear your concerns.
Thank you. We had spoken earlier, and your suggestion, Mark, of a letter, I think, is a good one in follow-up to this. So thank you for that. The hearing is adjourned, and thank you so much.